Margaret Henderson stood at her bay window, arms crossed, watching with barely concealed disdain as her new neighbor struggled to unload a battered pickup truck. The November wind whipped dead leaves across her meticulously maintained lawn in the affluent suburb of Winchester, Massachusetts, and she clicked her tongue in disapproval as some of those leaves settled on her property. The man across the street, James Walker, she'd learned from the neighborhood gossip, wore worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt that had seen better days. His hands were rough and calloused, marking him as someone who worked with them for a living. Everything about him screamed working class, and Margaret couldn't understand how he'd managed to rent the old Collins house. "Can you believe it, Richard?" she asked her husband, who was absorbed in his Wall Street Journal. "The neighborhood association should have stricter screening processes. This isn't some blue-collar district." Richard barely looked up from his paper, used to his wife's frequent complaints about anything that disturbed her carefully curated world. "He passed the background check, dear, and Mrs. Collins vouched for him personally." Margaret scoffed. "Eleanor Collins is getting senile, renting to a handyman? What's next? A whole trailer park moving in?" She watched as James carefully carried what looked like carpentry tools into the house. The man moved with deliberate care, each step measured and precise, despite his obvious exhaustion. Margaret had to admit there was something dignified about his movements, but she quickly dismissed the thought. Their own home was a testament to the Henderson family's success, a colonial revival masterpiece with perfectly maintained grounds and a 3-car garage housing their luxury vehicles. Richard's position as CEO of a prominent investment firm had afforded them every comfort, and Margaret had worked tirelessly to maintain their social standing in Winchester's upper echelons. The arrival of James Walker threatened to disturb that carefully maintained image. "I heard he's a widower," their longtime housekeeper, Rosa, commented quietly as she dusted nearby. "Lost his wife to cancer last year. Has a teenage daughter too." Margaret turned sharply. "I don't recall asking for gossip, Rosa." Rosa had been with them for 15 years and was one of the few people who could occasionally speak freely with Margaret. She met her employer's stern gaze without flinching. "No, Mrs. Henderson, you didn't, but sometimes it helps to know the story behind the person." "Story? What story?" "He's clearly someone who couldn't make it in life, and now he's bringing down our property values." Margaret's voice dripped with contempt. "And speaking of stories, I need you to help prepare for our Thanksgiving dinner party. The guest list includes Judge Morrison and his wife this year." Rosa nodded, knowing better than to pursue the subject of the new neighbor. The Hendersons' annual Thanksgiving celebration was legendary in their social circle, an elaborate affair that Margaret used to showcase her perfect life and cement their social standing. As Margaret began detailing her plans for the upcoming feast, she noticed a young girl joining James outside. The teenager had her father's dark hair and moved with the same careful grace, but there was something fragile about her, like a bird with a broken wing trying to fly. She helped her father unload boxes, her movements slow and deliberate. "That must be his daughter," Rosa said softly. "I heard she's still recovering from the accident that—" "Rosa," Margaret cut her off sharply. "The party plans?" But even as Margaret threw herself into planning her perfect Thanksgiving celebration, she couldn't shake the image of that girl's careful movements. There was something in them that spoke of pain, not just physical, but the deeper kind that comes from loss. Margaret pushed the thought away. She had more important things to worry about than some working-class tragedy. Her dinner party would include the most influential people in Winchester, and everything had to be perfect. She'd worked too hard to maintain their social status to let anything or anyone threaten it now. As the days crept closer to Thanksgiving, Margaret found herself increasingly irritated by James Walker's presence across the street. He was always working on something, fixing his porch, maintaining his lawn, or helping elderly Mrs. Peterson next door with her gardening. It was as if he was deliberately trying to show up the other neighbors with his constant industriousness. What infuriated her most was how the neighborhood seemed to be warming to him. Mrs. Peterson couldn't stop praising that dear Mr. Walker for fixing her roof and refusing payment. Even Richard had mentioned something about James helping to repair old Mr. Thompson's classic car one weekend. He's actually quite knowledgeable about vintage automobiles, Richard had said over breakfast. Did you know he used to restore them professionally before... Before what? Before he couldn't make it in a real profession, Margaret had snapped. Really, Richard, I don't need to know his life story. But as Margaret watched James and his daughter through her window each day, she couldn't help but notice things. The way he always made sure his daughter was warmly dressed before they left for school in the morning. How he worked late into the evening but never missed being there when she returned home. The gentle way he supported her as they walked to his truck, especially on days when she seemed to be struggling more than usual. These observations only served to irritate Margaret further. She didn't want to see these glimpses of humanity in someone she had decided didn't belong in her world. It was easier to maintain her disdain when she could pretend he was just another threat to her perfect neighborhood. But fate had other plans for Margaret Henderson's perfectly ordered world. And as Thanksgiving approached, she would learn that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the people we're most determined to dismiss. Have you ever judged someone before really getting to know them? Share your experience in the comments. And if this story has you hooked, don't forget to like for the next part. The week before Thanksgiving brought an unexpected cold snap to Winchester. Margaret spent her days orchestrating an army of workers who transformed her home into a showcase of autumn splendor. Crystal glasses sparkled in carefully arranged place settings, and imported linens graced tables that would soon hold enough food to feed half the neighborhood. The forecast mentions possible snow, Rosa commented as she helped arrange elaborate centerpieces. First time in years for Thanksgiving, Margaret frowned, checking her phone's weather app. It better not interfere with the party. Judge Morrison and his wife are driving in from Boston, and the Whitmans are flying their private jet from New York specifically for this dinner. Through the window, she could see James Walker on a ladder checking his gutters and roof. His daughter stood at the bottom, holding the ladder steady despite her obvious difficulty with balance. Margaret noticed the girl was wearing a knee brace today, something she hadn't seen before. Sarah, she heard James call down, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Go inside where it's warm. I can manage this. I'm fine, Dad. The girl, Sarah, responded with a stubborn determination that reminded Margaret of someone she tried hard to forget. The sight stirred something uncomfortable in Margaret's chest. She turned away sharply, focusing instead on directing the florist who was creating elaborate arrangements for the foyer. Yet her mind kept drifting to another teenager who had once shown the same determination, who had insisted she was fine, even when she wasn't. Mrs. Henderson? Rosa's voice broke through her thoughts. The organic turkey farm called. There's a problem with your order. Margaret seized on the distraction. What do you mean, a problem? I ordered that heritage turkey months ago. The next hours dissolved into a flurry of calls and arrangements as Margaret tried to salvage her plans for the perfect turkey. She'd specifically chosen a rare heritage breed that cost more than most people spent on a week's groceries. The thought of serving a common supermarket turkey to Judge Morrison was unthinkable. As evening approached, the weather began to turn. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the first few snowflakes began to fall. Margaret stood at her window again, watching as James helped Sarah inside their house. The girl was moving more stiffly now, clearly affected by the cold. Mom, a voice called from upstairs. Mom, have you seen my medication? Margaret froze. Her son Jason's voice sent a wave of anxiety through her that she quickly suppressed. Check the bathroom cabinet, dear. I organized everything last week. I did. It's not there. The calm facade Margaret had maintained all day cracked slightly. Jason's medication wasn't something that could be easily replaced, especially not before a major holiday. The specialist who prescribed it was already away for Thanksgiving. Rosa, she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. Please help Jason look. I need to finish these arrangements. But as the sky darkened and the snow began to fall more heavily, Margaret found herself facing a perfect storm of crises. The turkey farm called again. Their delivery truck had skidded off the road due to the unexpected snow. The florist was worried about completing all the arrangements in time. And worst of all, Jason's medication was nowhere to be found. "Richard," she finally called her husband in desperation. "Can you please leave work early? We need to find Jason's medication. I'm stuck in an emergency board meeting, dear. The markets are acting up due to some unexpected news from Asia. Can't it wait until tomorrow?" Margaret felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crack. She knew what could happen if Jason missed his medication. The seizures that had nearly destroyed him as a child. The ones they'd worked so hard to control with exactly the right combination of drugs and care. The snow was falling heavily now, transforming Winchester's pristine streets into treacherous paths of ice and slush. Margaret watched as cars crawled carefully past her house, their headlights creating ghostly patterns in the swirling snow. Across the street, James Walker's truck was pulling into his driveway, returning from whatever job he'd been working on. She saw him help Sarah from the truck, both of them struggling slightly in the slick conditions. But what caught her attention was the bag he carried. It was from Winchester Pharmacy, the same place where she filled Jason's prescriptions. "Mom," Jason's voice carried a note of panic now. "I really need my medication." Margaret felt her heart racing. She thought of all the times she'd looked down on James Walker, all the times she'd dismissed him as beneath her notice. But now, as her perfect world teetered on the edge of chaos, she found herself facing a choice: maintain her pride or seek help from the very person she'd scorned. A crash from upstairs, followed by Jason's frightened call, made the decision for her. Margaret grabbed her coat, her designer boots slipping slightly on the marble foyer floor. As she opened her front door, the bitter wind whipped at her face, carrying with it the first real taste of winter and, perhaps, the first real taste of humility she'd experienced in years. What would you do in Margaret's situation? Share your opinion, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Things are about to get even more intense. Margaret Henderson had never felt more vulnerable than she did crossing the street to James Walker's house. The snow whirled around her expensive cashmere coat and her Italian leather boots, perfect for impressing guests but useless in this weather, slipped on the icy pavement. Her heart pounded with each step, a mixture of fear for Jason and the unfamiliar sensation of having to ask for help from someone she'd so thoroughly dismissed. She reached his front door just as James was helping Sarah inside. He turned at the sound of her approaching footsteps, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Mrs. Henderson?" He steadied Sarah with one hand while holding the door open. "Is everything all right?" Margaret struggled to find the right words. She'd spent so long looking down on this man that now, needing his help, her carefully cultivated superiority felt like a wall between them. I saw you had a bag from Winchester Pharmacy," she managed, her voice smaller than she'd ever heard it. "My son, Jason, he needs his medication. We can't find it. And the pharmacy is closing early because of the storm." James's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Sarah, honey, can you make it inside okay?" The girl nodded, though Margaret noticed her grip tighten on the doorframe. There was something in Sarah's eyes, not judgment, but a deep understanding that made Margaret want to look away. "Come in, Mrs. Henderson," James said, holding the door wider. "This isn't weather to stand around in." Margaret hesitated for a moment before the urgency of Jason's need pushed her forward. She stepped into a home she'd spent months judging from afar, and what she saw stopped her in her tracks. The interior was modest but immaculately maintained. Warm light spilled from simple but elegant fixtures, illuminating walls covered with framed photographs. But what caught her eye was the medical equipment carefully arranged in one corner of the living room: a physical therapy bench, resistance bands, and what looked like specialized exercise equipment. "What medication does Jason need?" James asked, setting down his pharmacy bag and shrugging off his work coat. "It's for his seizures," Margaret found herself explaining, the words tumbling out. "He's been stable for years, but if he misses a dose—" "Anticonvulsants," Sarah said quietly from where she'd settled on the couch. "Like the ones I take sometimes." Margaret turned to the girl, really seeing her for the first time. Sarah's dark hair was pulled back in a neat braid, revealing a thin scar that disappeared into her hairline. The knee brace she wore was just one of several supports visible beneath her clothing. "The accident," Sarah explained, catching Margaret's gaze. "Drunk driver, Mom." She paused, swallowing hard. "Mom didn't make it. I got lucky," they said, "but there's still a lot of healing to do." James moved to his daughter's side, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Sarah's neurologist is actually the one who helped us find this rental." "Dr. Patterson? Elizabeth Patterson?" Margaret's voice caught. She's Jason's doctor too." A cry from across the street shattered the moment. "Mom!" Margaret turned toward the sound, her heart in her throat. Through the swirling snow she could see Jason at their front door. "I have extra doses," Sarah said quickly. "Same medication, different strength maybe, but it could help until you can get to the pharmacy tomorrow." James was already moving to a carefully organized medication cabinet. "I can check the dosage against Jason's prescription. I've gotten pretty good at managing medical details this past year." Margaret stood frozen, overwhelmed by the kindness from people she'd treated with nothing but contempt. She watched as James quickly checked labels and dosages with the expertise of someone who'd learned these skills through necessity and love. "Here," he said, holding out a bottle. "This should work for tonight. We can call Dr. Patterson to confirm if you'd like." Margaret took the bottle with trembling hands. "I don't know how to thank you." "Mom!" Jason's voice was more urgent now. "Go," Sarah said softly. "We understand." As Margaret turned to leave, James grabbed his coat. "Let me help you across the street. The ice is getting worse." The journey back to her house was treacherous, but James's strong grip kept her steady. They reached Jason just as he was starting to sway, the familiar pre-seizure dizziness taking hold. James helped get Jason to the living room couch while Margaret quickly measured out the medication. As she administered it to her son, she saw her perfect home through new eyes. The expensive decorations and elaborate Thanksgiving preparations seemed hollow compared to the simple warmth she'd felt in James's house. "He should be okay in a few minutes," James said quietly, his experienced eye assessing Jason's condition. Sarah's episodes used to be much worse, right after the accident, but the right medication, the right care, it makes all the difference. Margaret looked at this man she'd dismissed as beneath her, this father who'd rebuilt his entire life around his daughter's needs, and felt shame wash over her in waves. How many times had she complained about the inconvenience of Jason's condition while hosting her perfect parties? How many times had she tried to hide his medical needs from their social circle, afraid it would somehow diminish their standing? The snow continued to fall outside, and somewhere in the distance, a plow truck's warning beep cut through the evening air. Margaret's phone buzzed with messages. The florist cancelling due to weather, guests warning they might not make it tomorrow. Her perfect Thanksgiving unraveling with each passing minute. But as she watched Jason's color return to normal, as she saw the gentle way James spoke to him about cars to keep him calm while the medication took effect, she realized she was experiencing a different kind of Thanksgiving lesson, one about the true meaning of gratitude, humility, and the price of pride. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you had to swallow your pride and ask for help? Tell us your story in the comments. If this message touched your heart, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. As the evening progressed, the storm intensified. Margaret sat beside Jason, who had fallen into a peaceful sleep on the couch, while James helped Rosa secure the outdoor Thanksgiving decorations that were threatening to blow away in the strengthening wind. Through the window, she could see her elaborate outdoor lighting displays swaying precariously. The carefully arranged harvest scenes she'd commissioned, now half buried in snow. "The governor just declared a state of emergency," Richard called from his study. "They're asking people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary." Margaret's phone buzzed again. Another cancelled guest. The perfect Thanksgiving she'd planned was dissolving like snowflakes on warm glass. But strangely, as she stroked Jason's hair and watched him sleep peacefully, she found the cancellations didn't bother her as much as they should have. James returned from outside, stamping snow from his boots in the foyer. "I've secured what I could, but this storm isn't letting up. You might want to consider moving some things to higher ground. They're saying the creek behind your property could flood with all this snow and the frozen ground." Margaret felt her blood run cold. "The basement, all the extra food for tomorrow is stored in the basement freezers." She rushed to the basement door and flicked on the light. Already, she could see a thin sheet of water creeping across the floor near the back wall. The expensive heritage turkey she'd finally managed to secure, the imported delicacies, the wines, everything was at risk. "Rosa," she called out, panic rising in her voice, "we need to move everything upstairs." But Rosa, who had been Margaret's steady support through countless crises, was nowhere to be found. Richard appeared at the top of the stairs, his face grave. "Rosa's husband just called," he said. "Their neighborhood is flooding. She had to leave to help evacuate their elderly neighbors." Margaret stood at the top of the basement stairs, watching the water slowly advance. All her perfectly laid plans, all the expensive preparations, none of it mattered if she couldn't save the food, but she couldn't leave Jason alone. Not so soon after his near seizure. "I can help," James offered quietly. "Sarah's resting comfortably at home with her evening medication. I've got time." Margaret turned to look at him, this man she'd judged so harshly, now offering help she desperately needed. "I couldn't ask you to." "You're not asking," he said simply. "I'm offering. Besides, I've got some experience with flood prevention from my contracting work." For the next 2 hours, Margaret found herself working alongside James Walker in her basement. He quickly organized an efficient system, showing her how to stack boxes to keep them dry, helping her move the freezer contents to the kitchen upstairs. His strong hands made quick work of tasks that would have taken her hours, and his calm demeanor kept her focused when she wanted to panic. As they worked, he shared stories about his life, not because she asked, but because the silence needed filling. She learned about his years running a successful classic car restoration business, about meeting his wife Claire at a classic car show, about their dreams of opening their own shop together. He spoke about how quickly it had all changed. Claire's diagnosis, the mounting medical bills, the choice to sell the business to pay for her treatment. "Claire made me promise," he said, as they carried the last box upstairs, "to keep going, to make sure Sarah had every chance to heal. That's why we moved here. Winchester has one of the best physical therapy centers in the state. The rent's killing me. But Sarah's progress," he smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his whole face. "It's worth every penny." Something broke inside Margaret as she listened. Some wall she'd built around her heart years ago when Jason was first diagnosed, when she'd decided that perfection was the only acceptable face to show the world. Jason was 3 when he had his first seizure, she found herself saying, the words spilling out after years of careful silence. "We were at a garden party. He just collapsed, started convulsing. Everyone was staring, whispering. After that, I couldn't bear their pity, their judgment, so I decided we had to be perfect in every other way, as if that could somehow make up for what they saw as a flaw." James set down the box he was carrying and looked at her with understanding that held no trace of pity. "It's exhausting, isn't it, trying to be perfect all the time?" Before Margaret could respond, a loud crack split the air, followed by the distinctive sound of breaking glass. They rushed upstairs to find that a tree branch had crashed through the dining room window, sending shards of glass across her perfectly set Thanksgiving table. The bitter wind whipped through the broken window, scattering her carefully arranged place cards and sending her expensive centerpieces crashing to the floor. Margaret stared at the destruction, the snow coating her imported tablecloth, the broken crystal, the ruined decorations. Yesterday, this would have seemed like the end of the world. Now, looking at the chaos while Jason slept peacefully on the couch and knowing Sarah was safe and cared for across the street, it seemed almost trivial. "I can board that up for you," James said, already assessing the damage. I've got materials in my truck. It won't be pretty, but it'll keep the weather out until the glass company can come." As he spoke, the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the house into darkness. In the sudden quiet, Margaret could hear the wind howling through the broken window, and, somewhere upstairs, water dripping from where the snow had begun to melt through her perfect roof. In the darkness, Margaret Henderson, Queen of Winchester's social scene, perfectionist extraordinaire, began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle and grew into full-bodied laughter that contained years of tension, fear, and pretense. "Mrs. Henderson?" James's concerned voice came through the darkness. "Are you okay?" "Margaret," she said, still laughing as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. "Please, after everything tonight, I think you can call me Margaret. Life's storms sometimes bring the most valuable lessons. What do you think of Margaret's transformation? Share your thoughts and like if you believe everyone deserves a second chance." In the darkness of that snowbound Thanksgiving Eve, Margaret Henderson's perfectly ordered world had been turned upside down. The power outage had left her massive house cold and dark, save for the occasional flash of emergency vehicles passing outside, their lights creating ghostly patterns on the snow-covered walls through the hastily boarded window. James had worked quickly to secure the broken window, his experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency, even in the dim light of battery-powered lanterns. Now he was helping Richard check the circuit breaker, though they all knew the power outage extended far beyond their street. "The whole grid's down," Richard announced, returning to the living room where Margaret sat with Jason. "They're saying it could be out until tomorrow afternoon." Tomorrow? Margaret's mind raced to her refrigerators full of rescued food, the elaborate heating system that kept her house at a perfect 72 degrees, all the modern conveniences she'd taken for granted. "But it's Thanksgiving! The turkey!" She suddenly remembered, jumping up. "Everything we saved from the basement, it'll all spoil." "Not necessarily," James said, his voice calm in the darkness. "I have a generator at my house. It's not huge, but it runs our medical equipment and keeps our fridge going. We could store the essentials there." Margaret stared at the shadowy outline of her neighbor, this man she'd looked down on for months, who was now offering yet another lifeline. "I couldn't impose, Mom." Jason's voice came from the couch, stronger now after his rest. "It's freezing in here." The temperature was indeed dropping rapidly without the heating system. Margaret could see her breath in the beam of the flashlight, and Jason had started to shiver, despite the blankets she'd piled on him. "The cold isn't good for his condition," James said quietly. "Or for Sarah's, for that matter. Look, I have a proposal. My house isn't as large as yours, but it's warm. It has power, and there's plenty of room for all of us. Why don't you come over until the power's back?" Margaret felt Richard's hand on her shoulder. "He's right, dear. It's not safe to stay here with the temperature dropping like this." And so, in the strangest twist of this already surreal Thanksgiving Eve, Margaret found herself helping pack up essential food items and medical supplies to carry across the street. James made multiple trips through the snow, carrying boxes of food and supplies with steady determination. Richard helped Jason make his way carefully across the icy street, while Margaret followed with an armful of medications and a bag of warm clothes. Entering James's house for the second time that night felt different. The warmth enveloped them immediately, and the soft hum of the generator provided a reassuring backdrop to their movements. Sarah was awake, sitting in her favorite spot on the couch, and her face lit up at the sight of Jason. "You can set up in here," she said, patting the space beside her. "Dad always keeps it extra warm in this room because of my joints, and I have all the best medical channels bookmarked on the TV." As Margaret watched, Jason settled beside Sarah, and the two teenagers quickly fell into a conversation about their shared experiences with Dr. Patterson and the challenges of managing their conditions. There was an ease to their interaction that Margaret hadn't seen in Jason for years. No pretense, no need to hide or explain his condition. In the kitchen, James was efficiently organizing the rescued food, his movements sure and practiced. "We can fit the most important items in my fridge," he said, "and I have a camping stove we can use for cooking if needed." Used to do a lot of outdoor cooking with Claire and Sarah before." He trailed off, his hands stilling on the turkey Margaret had spent so much time and money securing. For a moment, she saw the same shadow of grief cross his face that she sometimes caught in her own reflection. The look of a parent bearing a burden they never expected to carry. "Claire loved Thanksgiving," he said softly, almost to himself. "She used to say it was the only holiday that was just about being grateful for what you have. No presents needed. Last year in the hospital, she made me promise that Sarah and I would still celebrate, still find things to be thankful for." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you stay so strong?" James looked at her, his eyes kind but serious. "I'm not strong, Margaret. I'm just doing what needs to be done. Same as you with Jason. We do what we have to for our kids." In the living room, they could hear Sarah and Jason laughing at something on TV. The sound was so natural, so normal, that it made Margaret's heart ache. "I've spent so long trying to hide Jason's condition," she confessed, leaning against the kitchen counter, planning perfect parties, maintaining the perfect image, as if being perfect in everything else could somehow make up for what I saw as our family's flaw. But watching him tonight, seeing him with Sarah, he seems happier than he has in years. "Kids are remarkably resilient," James said, beginning to unpack more of the rescued food. "They don't need perfect, they just need real." As the night progressed, something remarkable began to happen in James Walker's modest home. Richard and James discovered a shared passion for classic cars, falling into an animated discussion about engine restoration. Sarah showed Jason her collection of medical humor memes, something Margaret didn't even know existed, and the sounds of their laughter filled the warm air. Margaret found herself in the kitchen with James, preparing what they could for the next day's meal. Her expensive heritage turkey sat next to his more modest one, and somehow it seemed right to combine them, to make one meal from what they both had to offer. "We can smoke them," James suggested, his eyes lighting up. "I have a smoker out back, runs on wood. Claire's brother taught me how. It's different from roasting, but I promise you, it's something special." As they worked together, Margaret began to see the beauty in imperfection. James's kitchen wasn't equipped with the latest appliances, but every tool had its place. Every space was organized with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make the most of what he had. He taught her tricks for cooking with limited resources, skills he'd developed during Claire's illness when time and money were both in short supply. Around midnight, with preparations as complete as they could make them, Margaret found herself sitting in James's living room, watching her son sleep peacefully beside Sarah, who had also drifted off during their TV marathon. The two teenagers had somehow arranged themselves to accommodate each other's medical needs. Sarah's leg elevated on a pillow, Jason positioned safely in case of a seizure. Richard had dozed off in an armchair, a car magazine open on his lap. The storm still raged outside, but in this house she had once looked down upon, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. "Penny, for your thoughts?" James asked softly, offering her a cup of tea. "I was just thinking about everything I was so worried about yesterday," she said, accepting the cup. "The perfect table settings, the imported decorations, the right wines paired with the right courses. It all seems so unnecessary," James suggested gently. "Empty," Margaret corrected. "I was so focused on creating the perfect image that I forgot what Thanksgiving is really about. Your wife was right. It's about being grateful for what you have." James nodded, his eyes drifting to Sarah. "Claire would have loved this, you know. Not the storm, obviously, but this, people coming together, helping each other. She always said that the best memories come from the unexpected moments." As if in response to his words, the wind howled particularly fiercely outside, rattling the windows. But instead of feeling anxious about her damaged house or ruined plans, Margaret felt strangely secure in this smaller, warmer space. "Tomorrow won't be the Thanksgiving I planned," she said, sipping her tea. "No judge or society friends, no elaborate service or perfect presentations." "No," James agreed. "But it might be exactly the Thanksgiving you needed." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the poor neighbor she'd dismissed, but a man of quiet strength and deep compassion. A man who had faced losses she couldn't imagine and emerged not bitter, but somehow more kind, more human. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. Not just tonight, but for showing me what really matters. I've been so wrong about so many things." "We all have our moments of clarity," James replied. "Sometimes it takes a storm to clear our vision." As Thanksgiving dawn broke over Winchester, the snow finally began to ease. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of pristine white that made everything look new and clean. The power was still out in much of the neighborhood, and Margaret's perfect house stood dark and silent across the street. But in James Walker's warm kitchen, two families who had begun the night as strangers worked side by side, preparing a very different kind of Thanksgiving feast. The sophisticated menu Margaret had planned was replaced by something more rustic, but somehow more fitting. Two turkeys slowly smoking in James's backyard smoker, filling the air with an incredible aroma. While inside, Sarah taught Jason how to make her mother's famous cornbread stuffing, and Margaret Henderson, who had spent years pursuing an impossible perfection, found herself learning that sometimes the most precious things in life come not from careful planning, but from the moments when all our plans fall apart. As she watched her son laugh with Sarah, saw her husband and James deep in conversation about a car restoration project they were planning together, she realized that this unplanned, imperfect Thanksgiving had given her something her carefully orchestrated parties never could: a genuine sense of gratitude, community, and belonging. The storm had destroyed her perfect Thanksgiving, but in doing so, it had given her something far more valuable: a chance to start again, to see beyond the surface, and to learn that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the people we least expect. This special Thanksgiving story reminds us that true gratitude is born in the most unexpected moments.